On the evening this story was first told, the rain had not yet decided whether it meant to remain rain. It touched the tavern windows in a fine silver tapping, paused as if listening to the fire, then began again with a harder sound. Every traveler who came through the door carried a little of the cold inside. It shone on woolen shoulders and darkened the hems of cloaks. Near the hearth, gloves had been spread upon a bench, and from them rose the faint, clean smell of wet leather. A small brass bell hung beside the chimney. It was no larger than a walnut cup, and so old that the cord beneath it had faded from red to the brown of dried leaves. The tavern keeper said it had once been tied to a mountain goat, though another patron was certain it had belonged to a river barge. No one had ever heard it ring. The bell moved when the outer door opened, and sometimes it trembled when the fire drew a strong breath up the chimney, but its little tongue never touched the metal. That night, a traveler from the southern plains watched it sway. How did people know when the first snow had come, he asked, before there were good roads to carry the news? The storyteller in the corner turned a clay cup slowly between his palms. In Bellhaven, he said, they listened for the bells. Bellhaven stood in a high valley, and the people there believed the first snow was not truly the first until all 12 bells had spoken through it. Not the sound of iron or bronze, but the sound of water moving in the dark. Its grey walls followed the lower slopes, rising behind roofs of slate wooden galleries, narrow gardens, and chimneys that seemed to grow in clusters. Above the northern wall, the land climbed through sheep pastures and pine woods to a line of pale mountains. Below the southern gate, it fell away toward coppiced oak, charcoal clearings, and the long road to warmer country. The town was built of stone, but it lived by wood. Wood fed its ovens and warmed its houses. It became cradles, doors, spoons, shutters, carts, roof pegs, loom frames, tool handles, and the carved gutters beneath the eaves. Even Bellhaven's water traveled inside wood. From a spring high on the northern hill, it entered a covered reservoir and descended through great pipes made from long curved staves. The pipes ran beneath streets and courtyards, dividing into narrower channels that filled fountains, bakehouse cisterns, wash troughs, monastery tanks, and the deep stone basin beside the market. Few people thought about those hidden conduits. Water appeared when a tap was opened. A bucket filled when lowered. The public fountain spoke into its basin, day and night, and its patient voice seemed as permanent as the hills. Tamsin Reed thought about the pipes often enough for everyone else. Her workshop stood in the Cooper's Lane near the eastern wall, where the ring of mallets began before sunrise and shavings gathered in pale drifts beneath the doors. The sign above her lintel showed a barrel bound by 3 iron hoops. It had been painted by her father and retouched so many times that the barrel had grown rounder with every coat. Tamsin made casks for ale, vats for dye, tubs for salted meat, and small lidded firkins for households that could afford to store butter through winter. She chose oak for strength, ash for spring, and chestnut when the contents might sour against the wrong wood. She could look along a stave and see where it would bend before it had touched steam. She could hear a loose hoop in the tone of a finished barrel. When she worked, the restlessness in her mind arranged itself into useful measures: thumb widths, finger joints, angles, grain, heat, and the space. A swelling stave must be given if it was not to split. The only work she refused was work on Bellhaven's old water system. Requests came rarely. The town's maintenance crew could patch a small leak, replace a collar, or clear roots from a branch line. When a job required a cooper's skill, Tamsin sent it to Fen Alder, who lived in the next valley, and charged enough to make every council clerk sigh. If anyone asked why, she said she had orders waiting. There were always orders waiting. On the first morning of the autumn counting, she was fitting an oak head into a flour cask for Mirasol, the baker. Every year, when the last geese passed southward over Bellhaven, the town counted the days until snow. The count was not exact, and that was part of its importance. Roofs were checked because no one knew whether there were 20 dry days left or 7. Chimneys were swept, apples wrapped, onions braided, and stacks of split wood moved beneath cover. Children gathered cones for kindling, while their elders inspected boots, shutters, and flour bins. At the market, wool cloth vanished by the bolt. Tamsin had made her own preparations early. A neat wall of beech logs filled the shed behind her workshop. Oats, dried peas, onions, lamp oil, and 2 wheels of hard cheese stood on shelves in her kitchen. She had repaired the roof in late summer and packed moss into the one window frame that whistled during an eastern wind. If winter required nothing from her but work and silence, she intended to provide both. Mira did not believe in silence when conversation was available. "You have 6 jars of pickled cabbage," she observed, peering through the open door between the workshop and kitchen. 5. Bellhaven's communal bakehouse belonged to the council, but everyone knew it moved by Mira's will. She kept 4 ovens, 3 apprentices, 2 kneading tables, and 1 elderly cat in a state of firm cooperation. "Then you are entirely prepared to be snowed in with 6 jars of sour vegetables," she said. 5 jars of sour vegetables and 1 of sour roots. Mira watched for a moment. "The Western oven's cistern was slow this morning. He says the market fountain is also low." "Good." By afternoon, the fountain in the Cooper's Lane had weakened from a steady stream to a braided thread. People noticed it because a queue formed where none usually did. A dyer's boy leaned against the wall with 2 empty buckets. An old woman filled her jug and found that she had time to exchange a complete account of her granddaughter's marriage prospects before the water reached the rim. Tamsin crossed the lane to look. The fountain basin was cut from a single block of dark stone. A bronze pipe emerged from the wall above it, green at the edges, polished bright underneath by generations of hands. The water ran clear. There was no sand in it, no bark, no black stain from rotting wood. That meant the trouble was probably not a collapsed branch close by. It might be air. It might be the reservoir. It might be a dozen things she had taught herself not to consider. She returned to the workshop and shut the door. The white sprig arrived the next morning. Brother Caddock sent one every autumn from the shelter of St. Aura, which stood above the last pine trees on the mountain road. Most years it was a twig of juniper, brushed with frost and wrapped in gray wool. This year, the messenger carried it into the market with snow still caught between the blue-green needles. The sight drew people from shops and doorways. Children followed the messenger to the council hall. Traders looked north, though the mountains were hidden behind cloud. Before midday, the sprig had been placed on a black cloth beneath the market bell, where everyone could see it. The custom said the town had 10 days after the white sprig came, perhaps 12 if the southern wind returned, perhaps 6 if the cloud remained low and the sheep descended without being driven. That afternoon, the first bell sounded, the small iron bell above the northern gate. It did not announce snow. It announced the beginning of the final winter preparations. Its slow strokes told woodsellers to settle their loads inside the walls, shepherds to bring down the high flocks, and households to report any roof or chimney that could not be made sound without help. Tamsin stood at her workbench and counted the strokes, despite herself. There were 9. When the last one faded, she heard water dripping beneath the floor. Her workshop had a narrow inspection, hollow at the back, covered by 3 planks. It gave access to a branch pipe that supplied the lane fountain and continued toward the eastern washhouse. Tamsin had not lifted those boards in 8 years. Dust filled the seams. One plank still bore the dark half-circle made by her father's oil lamp. She told herself the sound might be rain beneath the foundation. It came again. A hollow drop, then another. She knelt and pulled up the first board. Cold air touched her face. The hollow smelled of damp stone and old timber. When her eyes adjusted, she saw the pipe. 4 long staves bound into a narrow wooden conduit with iron collars. Moisture glistened on its lower curve. A bead of water gathered at one joint, swelled, and dropped into the darkness beneath. Tamsin reached down and pressed 2 fingers to the stave. The wood was wet but firm. The leak was not large enough to explain the failing fountain. More troubling was what she felt through her fingertips. Almost nothing. Water should have thrummed inside the pipe. Even with the fountain tap closed, the line should have held pressure. Instead, it felt like touching a sleeping branch. She replaced the boards carefully. For several breaths, she remained on her knees, one hand resting on the wood her father had marked with his lamp. Then bells began ringing at the bakehouse. Not the market bell or the northern gate bell. These were 2 handbells, struck in quick alternation by Mira's apprentices. Their purpose was ordinarily to summon neighbors when bread was ready for a feast. That day, they summoned anyone with buckets. The great cistern beneath the bakehouse had fallen below its intake pipe. Bellhaven's 4 communal ovens could still burn, but without water, there would be no mixing, no washing, and no safe way to manage sparks. Mira closed 2 ovens at once. By the time Tamsin arrived, people were carrying water from private wells and the monastery tank. Steam clouded the long room. Unbaked loaves waited beneath cloths, rising past the moment when they should have entered the heat. Halric, the head of the maintenance crew, stood knee-deep in the cistern with a lantern held above his head. He was a careful man whose narrow face always seemed to be considering a nail no one else had noticed. "The intake is clear," he said when Tamsin leaned over the opening. "So is the line as far as I can reach." He did not ask how she knew. "Market line too. Monastery says their upper tank was half full at dawn. It should have filled overnight." The ovens still breathed. Buckets still passed hand to hand. Yet she could feel the attention gathering, gentle in some faces and merely frightened in others. "You know these conduits," Halric said. "I know barrels." Halric climbed from the cistern. "We opened the inspection chamber on Tallow Street. The main line is seeping at 2 collars. There may be more beyond them. We can patch what we see. We need someone who can tell us what we cannot." Small oat breads for families who had brought their grain to the communal mill and received flour by weight. Bellhaven stored wheat, but most households relied on the bakehouse. Winter without its ovens was not an inconvenience to be endured behind a shut workshop door. "The council will meet at dusk," Halric said. "They asked for you. And when the upper conduit failed," she continued, "they put his name in the ledger beside the loss." 8 years earlier, she had stood beside her father in the council hall, while men who knew nothing of steamed oak described his repair as careless. The upper conduit had burst during a spring thaw, flooding 2 storerooms and washing seed grain into the street. No one had died. The grain had been replaced before planting. Yet, the failed work remained in the official record, written more neatly than any account of the repairs he had completed over 40 years. Her father had never defended himself well with words. He had returned to the workshop and defended himself with labor until his hands could no longer close around a mallet. After his death, Tamsin had inherited the tools, the sign, and the silence. She had believed silence could keep the old shame from changing shape. Now the cistern yawned empty beneath the bakehouse. "I will look," she said. "That is not the same as promising I can mend it." Bellhaven had 7 council seats, though one was empty because its owner had gone to bring cattle down from the western pasture. Orrin Hale, keeper of maps and civic records, sat at the end with 3 rolled plans before him. He was a small elderly man, with a white beard cut square at the bottom and fingers permanently stained by ink. Tamsin remembered him from the hearing after the upper conduit failed. He had been younger then, though already old in her mind, and he had read from the ledger without once looking at her father. Now he stood when she entered. Mistress Reed. The remaining seats were held by a wool merchant, the monastery steward, the warden of the gates, a miller, and 2 household representatives chosen by the streets. Their unease differed in appearance, but not in weight. Oren unrolled the largest plan. It showed Bellhaven from above, flattened into lines of brown ink. Streets crossed like stitching. The wall formed an uneven ring. A blue-green line began at the northern reservoir, entered the town beneath the gate, and divided into branches. The main conduit is 214 years old in its earliest sections, Oren said. Replaced piece by piece, of course. The southern length was renewed 60 years ago. The Tallow Street section, 31 years ago. The upper line. His eyes lifted. Yes. One break large enough to empty the system would carry wood, soil, or air into the lower branches. The water is clear. The trouble may be at the reservoir, but if it were only there, the pipes would drain evenly. These have not. Or one failure where the plan is wrong. They shifted around foundations, roots, graves, forgotten cellars, and whatever stone had refused to yield when the trench was dug. Every repair changed a little of their course. Every change depended on whether someone returned to the hall and told Oren's predecessors exactly what had been done. I need the inspection chambers opened from the reservoir to the southern basin, she said. No patches until I have seen the grain around each leak. I need lengths measured, not copied from this plan. I need the reservoir level marked tonight and again at dawn, and I need every public tap closed for 2 hours tomorrow morning. If we do not learn where the water goes, they may have no taps to open in 6 days. Will you take charge of the assessment? And she thought, with an honesty that did not flatter her, that part of her wanted to mend the system simply so no one could ever speak the name Reed with pity again. That was not the noblest reason to accept. It was enough to begin. I will take charge until the water runs, she said. Outside, the market bell sounded the hour. Beyond the walls, cloud rested low upon the northern hills. Inside the council hall, Oren placed the old plan into Tamsin's hands. The parchment was heavier than she expected. Before sunrise, the public taps were closed. Bellhaven had been warned by bell and runner, yet the closing still produced astonishment. People turned handles and stared at dry spouts, as though the town itself had broken a promise. Buckets stood ready in kitchens. Tubs had been filled the evening before. At the communal wells, those who possessed private ropes shared them with those who did not. For 2 hours, the familiar sound of running water left the streets. In its absence, Tamsin heard everything beneath it. She began at the northern reservoir with Halric and Oren. The reservoir occupied a low stone building tucked against the hill, just inside the wall. Its roof was covered with turf, and from a distance, it resembled a green mound with a locked oak door. Within, the spring entered through a grated channel and settled in a vaulted tank before passing into the main wooden conduit. At the marked stone, the water stood 2 handbreadths lower than it had at midnight. No one drew from the public lines, Halric said. Monastery closed its tank. Bakehouse, too. Oren held a lantern while she lowered a strip of wool into the current and counted slowly. Then she repeated the test at the outlet. More leaves than arrives, she said. A break below us then, Halric replied. Loss above and below. The spring has weakened, and the conduit is leaking. Or one trouble making us notice another. At each chamber, Tamsin wiped the conduit clean, tested the iron collars, pressed the wood, and listened with one end of a smooth rod against the stave and the other near her ear. The first section hummed faintly. The next held air. Beneath a tallow maker's yard, water seeped along the bottom of the trench and vanished into gravel. On Weaver's Rise, the line was dry enough that Tamsin could hear a pebble scratch along its interior when the crew opened a clean-out port. Oren measured every length with a waxed cord. He wrote the numbers on a board, then compared them with the plan. At first, the errors were small. 7 feet where the map promised 6. A turn beneath a stable that appeared on parchment as a straight line. A branch joining above the washhouse, rather than below. Changes accumulate, Oren said, more to the map than to Tamsin, only when no one records them. The next should have stood near a stone horse troughed by the wall. Halrich's men lifted the paving stones around it and found undisturbed earth. Wrong side of the street, Halrich suggested. They dug there too. Nothing. Tamsin returned to the first chamber. The main pipe entered from the north and left toward the southeast, though Oren's plan showed it continuing south. She laid the waxed cord along the wood and sighted over it. It turns toward the old dye quarter. In one house, Tamsin crawled beneath a pantry while a family's winter apples hung in bags overhead. In a disused soap room, the conduit passed through a wall built around it. Under the remains of a dye shed, it descended so sharply that the crew had to lower a lantern by rope. At noon, the council bell rang to reopen the taps. The conduit shuddered. Air rushed through with a sound like breath drawn between teeth. Then water struck the staves, and a dozen small leaks revealed themselves in the light. None was large enough to explain the full loss. Halrich wiped mud from his hands. We have followed 300 paces since Tallow Street. According to this, you have followed 106. The council archives contain repair notes from every civic contract, he said. Every official contract. The wall of Bellhaven curved inward there, enclosing a rocky slope where few houses had ever stood. The official main line should have turned toward the market. Instead, the buried pipe seemed to run directly toward a sealed postern gate that had not been used within Tamsin's memory. We find where it goes, she said. Then we will know what it is doing. Today we find enough timber to replace what is already failing. Tomorrow we follow ghosts. The monastery had oak beams stored beneath its granary, yet they were square-cut and too precious to split without certainty. Tamsin inspected old vats, broken wagons, unused doors, and a disassembled wine press. Much of the wood was wormed, cracked, or bent against the grain. By mid-afternoon, she knew the visible leaks would require at least 40 long staves, perhaps 60. She had 11 suitable pieces in her workshop. Mira found her in the market, standing between 2 rows of empty stalls. The market was held 3 days each week in summer and twice in autumn. With snow approaching, the last traders were packing away canvas and taking their goods beneath permanent roofs. The stalls themselves belonged to merchants or guilds. Their planks had stood through years of sun and rain, silvered on the surface, but dry beneath. Tamsin placed one palm against the leg of a spice seller's counter. Elm, she said. Old, but sound. Absolutely not. He explained that the market structures represented private investment, that spring trading could not resume without them, and that no one could be expected to surrender useful property because the town had failed to maintain its pipes. Tamsin agreed with the last part. If the town takes the wood, she said, the town should replace it. You have just told us there is no timber. If anyone here knows a way to bake market benches into bread, we can leave them standing. In return, the Carpenters' Guild rebuilds every stall before the first spring market. Traders who surrender timber receive first choice of position. The council waives market dues until their cost is repaid, and every usable iron fitting comes back to its owner. Not yet. The potter's frame was pine and no use to Tamsin, but he could lend a cart. The Cloth Guild owned 6 stalls and could spare 3 if householders helped dismantle them. The fishmonger would yield his work table only if Tamsin promised the finished pipe would not make the water taste of onions, spices, wool, or anything else that had rested upon it. The inside surface will be planned away, Tamsin said. Deeply, Mira moved among the workers with a list, assigning promises the council had not yet made. Tamsin should have been horrified by the disorder. Instead, she felt the problem taking shape around her, not smaller, but divided into pieces that could be lifted. She selected oak and elm. She rejected 2 beautiful counters because hidden rot had entered around their nail holes. She showed apprentices how to look for grain that wandered too near an edge. People brought lanterns as evening settled. The market, usually emptied at dark, became a field of measured activity. Oren arrived while the spice seller's stall was being reduced to a stack of numbered timbers. He handed Mira a folded paper. "The council has agreed to your terms with amendments. The attached drawing is gone. Long boards were ripped into narrow staves by sawyers working in pairs. Each stave was planed, beveled, and passed through steam rising from iron cauldrons. Tamsin had built forms upon the floor, low curved frames around which the softened wood could be bent and held. The work was not identical to barrel making. A barrel stave bowed in 2 directions and joined its neighbors in a swelling curve. A conduit stave needed a gentler, steadier line. 4 or 6 staves formed a pipe, depending on its width. Their edges met at precise angles, too narrow and they pinched inward, too broad and the seam opened under pressure. At first, Tamsin performed every difficult step herself. She corrected a sawyer's line. She replaned an apprentice's bevel. She took the bending strap from Halric because he held it too high. Whenever someone asked what to do next, she left her own task and demonstrated. By midday, she had completed little, and everyone around her had learned only to wait for her hands. Mira arrived with bread and bowls of onion broth. "How much pipe have you made?" she asked. Tamsin pointed to 2 lengths cooling upon the forms. "How much do you need?" 2 of Halric's crew stood beside the steam cauldron. Mira's eldest apprentice, a red-haired girl named Linnet, was examining a stave with the solemn suspicion she usually reserved for dough that refused to rise. The suggestion unsettled Tamsin because it was correct. She ate the broth while it was warm. Then she divided the workers into groups. Each group learned one process, and no stave advanced until the person receiving it checked the work. The carpenter set the bevels. The sawyers inspected grain. Halric managed steaming and bending. Linnet learned to test edge contact with soot from a lamp. Rubbed thinly along one side, it revealed every gap when the matching stave was pressed against it. By evening, there were 7 good lengths and 3 that could be narrowed for branch lines. Only 1 had become firewood. The following morning, they began replacing the failed sections beneath Tallow Street. The first collar came away, rusted at its lower edge. When Halric's men lifted the damaged stave, black tar cracked along the seam and released the smell of wet earth. Beneath the coating, the wood showed a pattern of small cut marks. Tamsin cleaned it with a rag. There were 5 marks: a cross with 1 long arm, a circle divided by a line, 3 shallow cuts like bird tracks, a squared spiral, and a simple notch at the edge. "Joiner's marks?" Halric asked. "Some. Cooper's too." When they opened the adjoining length, they found 9 more. Tamsin had expected her grandfather's sign, perhaps her great-grandfather's. The reed mark was a pair of curved cuts meeting at the bottom like the outline of a narrow leaf. It appeared on 1 collar piece, but only once. Oren crouched beside the trench, holding his robe clear of the mud. Why mark pieces hidden beneath tar? One resembled a tiny ladder. Another was shaped like a fish. The marks continued across timber of different ages, showing that each generation had opened the pipe, replaced what it could, and left signs beneath the tar. Laborers from the streets, market craftsmen, apprentices whose names had not entered contracts. People who had perhaps been paid in coin, bread, exemption from a winter duty, or nothing beyond the knowledge that their own water would keep running. Tamsin traced the small ladder with her thumb. Her father had often said that a town was built twice, once where everyone could see it, and once beneath the floors. She had assumed he meant foundations drains, braces, and pipes. Now she wondered if he had meant the people whose work disappeared inside them. "Will you record these?" she asked Oren. He looked at the mud-dark staves. "If we know the names." After the visible breaks were replaced, the pressure improved at the northern taps and nowhere else. The market fountain rose for a few breaths, then sank again to a narrow stream. The bakehouse cistern filled to 1/4 and stopped. Water still moved through the hidden turn beneath the dye quarter, but no one knew where it went. Tamsin stood beside the sealed postern gate with the old plan in one hand and the new measurements in the other. Rain had ceased, leaving the air clear and colder. Above the town, the mountains showed through torn cloud. Snow whitened their upper shoulders. The pipe ran toward the wall, but no inspection chamber lay inside it. Halrick's crew searched the base stones until one man found a patch of mortar newer than the blocks around it. Behind that repair, a narrow conduit passed through the wall. "There is no outlet marked beyond the gate," Oren said. "There is no inlet marked here either," Tamsin replied. The postern's iron lock had rusted closed. The gate warden brought keys, oil, and finally a hammer. When the lock yielded, the door moved inward. Only the width of a hand before earth stopped it. The outside path had vanished beneath a century of washed soil. They climbed the wall stairs instead. From the parapet, the southern slope descended through bare hazel and low oak. Patches of wood smoke lay among the trees. Farther down, almost hidden by the folds of land, Tamsin saw the roofs of charcoal burners' huts. A footpath followed the wall eastward, then turned down toward them. On it stood a young man, carrying 2 empty wooden pails. He had paused when the postern gate struck its buried threshold. Now he looked up at the figures on the wall. One of the pails hung from his hand. The other rested against his boot. Both were dry. "That is Jory Fenn," Halrick said. "His family works the lower coppice." Tamsin, Oren, and Halrick left through the southern gate and followed the outer wall until they met Jory beneath the hazels. He was younger than Tamsin had first thought, perhaps 20, with charcoal dust in the lines of his hands and a green wool cap pulled low over dark hair. The empty pails were joined by a yoke that rested across his shoulders. "You opened the old postern," he said. "We tried," Halrick answered. "Do you use it?" The path wound through coppiced oaks, cut close to the ground, each old stool sending up a crown of straight young poles. Between the trees stood blackened circles where charcoal clamps had burned. Some were cold and covered with leaves. Others breathed a faint blue smoke through layers of turf and earth. The charcoal families lived in 6 small houses scattered along the slope, beyond the protection of the wall, but within the land governed by Bellhaven. Their houses were well kept. Roofs had been weighted with poles against winter wind. Wood was stacked beneath deep eaves. Gardens lay empty except for cabbage stalks and a few rows of leeks. Yet at every door stood buckets waiting for water. Jory led them to a stone basin below a large oak. A wooden spout projected from the bank. One drop formed at its lip, trembled, and fell. "It stopped yesterday morning," he said. "Before that it ran thin for a week." Her gray hair was tied beneath a red scarf, and her expression suggested that maps were only one more town-made object likely to fail when brought into the woods. "The pipe appears in the ground," she said. "We drink from that." She had been born in the lower coppice and had left it only once, for a summer when she worked at the Bellhaven tannery. "Who laid the branch?" Tamsin asked. "People with shovels. Town people came because their water had gone muddy. Our people showed them where the ground was firm. They moved the pipe this way and left us a branch. No guards came when wolves took goats, but our men paid gate tax on every sack of coal. When the town needed the conduit moved, they helped. A share of water was the bargain." The branch line passed through the bank behind it, narrower than the town main, but built with the same old staves. Jory helped her clear leaves from a small inspection cover. The wood within was wet. She put her listening rod against it. "There is water," she said. "Very little. Not at this flow. Every summer, roots had to be cut away from the basin outlet. Every spring, the branch was opened near a flat stone to let silt escape. The charcoal families had patched cracks with pine resin, linen, and thin bands of hazel, but the conduit belonged to Bellhaven, so they had never replaced a full section. They followed it uphill to the wall. In 2 places, water dampened the soil, yet the leaks were slight. At a fork hidden beneath the roots of a beech, Tamsin discovered something stranger. The branch to the basin did not simply split from the main line. A wooden gate valve had been built into a widened chamber. Its handle could divide the water between Bellhaven and the lower coppice. The valve was old, but not forgotten. Grease darkened the spindle. Someone had maintained it. "Who tends this?" she asked. Jory lifted one shoulder. "Whoever notices it is stiff." Tamsin examined the chamber. The main line entered from the north and emerged in 2 directions. One returned toward the town at a lower level, passing through the wall farther west than the place they had first searched. The other fed the charcoal basin. This explained the missing 200 paces. After the landslip, workers had rerouted the conduit outside Bellhaven's wall, using the natural slope to avoid unstable ground. The record had lost the change, but the water had followed it for more than a century. She leaned over the townward line and listened. There was the faint drag of water. Beneath it came another sound, an uneven knocking, slow and distant. "Air?" Halric asked. "Perhaps. Or a loose collar farther up." Their fuel heated the bakehouse ovens and the council hall. Their tax entered the town's books. Their water did not. "I will not close anything today," Tamsin said. "And tomorrow, restore the full flow to Bellhaven. Carry water by cart to the charcoal houses until the snow made the path impassable. After winter, the council would investigate whether a permanent arrangement should be recorded. No one spoke with cruelty. That made the decision harder to resist. The gate warden described the number of households within the walls. The miller listed the grain that needed washing and grinding. The monastery steward spoke of the infirmary tank. Bellhaven held more than 2,000 people. The lower coppice held 38. "A cart cannot reach them once the snow settles," Mira said. "They have a well," said the wool merchant. "A shallow one," Tamsin replied. "Sella says it freezes. No legal grant survives," he said, but the arrangement clearly existed. Closing the branch might increase the town flow. It might buy them the days needed to replace more leaks. If she refused, and the bakehouse stopped entirely, principals would not fill the cistern. "Give me 1 night," she said. "For what?" Fine flakes drifted there, but they were only pale seeds blown from the hill grasses. Brother Cadoc's second message says the high path will close within 4 days. Jory waited beneath the market awning. Someone had given him a bowl of Mira's stew, but it stood uneaten in his hands. "1 night," he said. "You heard. If the spring has weakened, the branch is not the cause." Mira had packed bread, hard cheese, and a flask of hot apple drink into a wool-lined basket. Oren wore 2 cloaks and carried a leather tube of records tied across his back. They could not use the direct reservoir path. A section above it had slipped after the week's rain, so they crossed the western sheep fields and climbed through the pine wood. Jory moved easily in the dark, finding stones where Tamsin saw only shadow. Oren climbed at a steady pace, though he paused often to breathe, and pretended each pause was needed to study the land. By first light, they reached the shelter of St. Aura. It was a low stone house built against a cliff, with a bell frame on its roof, and a narrow chapel joined to one side. Brother Cadoc tended the shelter alone during most of the year. He guided travelers, watched for changes in weather, and maintained markers along the high paths. His beard was more red than gray, but his eyebrows were white with frost when he opened the door. Bellhaven sends a cooper, a charcoal burner, and a keeper of maps, he said. Either the town is in trouble, or I have won an unusual wager. The spring beside the shelter turned cloudy for 1 hour, then cleared. Since then, its overflow channel had run low. Why did you not send that with the white sprig? Oren asked. I did. The message named snow, the ground movement, and the spring. The council clerk read only the customary line aloud. The spring feeding Bellhaven. Rose 1/2 mile farther north, where a limestone shelf met the forest floor. Along the way, they crossed 3 wet channels that did not appear on Oren's map. They were new, cut by rain, through leaf mold and black soil. One carried water over the path and down a rocky gully toward the western valley. This was dry in summer, Jory said. Caddock nodded. Dry last week. Tamsin stood between the lost stream and the reservoir channel. There was enough water. More than enough, perhaps. It had simply found another path. Closing the charcoal branch would improve pressure for an hour, she said. Then the reservoir would fall again. Rain had softened the slope below it. Any attempt to force the entire flow back into the old stone channel might release more soil and bury the spring house. Jory tested the ground with a hazel pole. Caddock pointed out firmer ridges. Tamsin watched how the water divided around roots and stones. A new channel here, Oren suggested. Stone-lined. There was another plan. Water would enter here and be released gradually through 2 lines. The work was never authorized. It would solve much of their trouble. It would also require a stone basin, lime mortar, a gated outlet, a roof, and weeks of dry weather. Jory crouched beside her. Could we make it from wood? Not here. She rolled the plan open against the trunk. The second basin was meant to hold water until the system could accept it, she said. What if we do that inside the town? Then we connect the larger neighborhood cisterns and sound storage casks to the branches. Fill them slowly. Draw from them during the day. The pipes will not need to carry every household's water at once. Your basin becomes part of the network. If Bellhaven's cisterns fill overnight, the town can spare pressure by day. If your families tend the outer valve, you can balance the lower line with us. Call them borrowed barrels. Then you should go and ask for them. Mira waited there beside a handcart, bringing empty vessels to the reservoir. Halric stood with her. Behind them, the town's taps were weaker than they had been that morning. Tamsin handed Oren the old civic map and kept the unfinished red plan. Do you have another answer? Mira asked. Tamsin looked over the roofs of Bellhaven. Beneath each roof were barrels of ale, vinegar, rainwater, salted apples, nails, flour, dried beans, and sometimes nothing at all. Each belonged to someone. Each would have to be emptied, cleaned, moved, connected, trusted, and returned. Yes, she said. It is much more difficult than the first one. Beside each branch, she marked every cistern large enough to matter. The monastery had 3. The bakehouse had 2. The washhouses had stone tanks beneath their floors. Brewers kept cooling vats. Fullers owned tubs that could be scrubbed free of lye. Inns stored rainwater. Private households possessed barrels of every size. The plan was not to pour spring water into whatever vessel came to hand. Each barrel would be inspected and cleaned. The soundest would be set on timber cradles in courtyards, cellars, and public sheds close to the branch lines. Narrow feed pipes would let them fill when demand was low. Simple wooden gate taps would isolate them if a seam opened. The existing large cisterns would serve as the main stores. During busy hours, households would draw from neighborhood tanks rather than opening every tap along the conduit. At night, water would travel slowly through the repaired lines and refill what the town had used. You intend to ration by street? asked one household representative. By branch, Tamsin said. Each branch will know what it holds. This is an abandoned idea altered into an untested one. The baker was already holding a blank list. Every cask in Bellhaven, Tamsin said, or near enough. Casks of ale and winter stores would not be seized. Households willing to empty them would be compensated from the council granary or the brewer's reserve. At first, almost no one came. One cracked rain barrel arrived on a wheelbarrow. A child carried a bucket with a missing handle. The monastery sent 2 enormous wine tuns that had dried so completely their staves rattled inside the hoops. Mira stood in the square, looking at the poor collection. Bellhaven owns more barrels than this. Others had begun filling containers privately and feared that reporting them meant surrendering their family's store. Tamsin could hardly blame them. She did not like lending her tools. A barrel was a household's quiet insurance, food through winter, ale through a wedding, water through a fire. She went back to her workshop. In the loft were 12 finished casks waiting for customers, including the flour cask Mira had ordered. 3 more stood partly made. Against the rear wall were her father's 2 great seasoning vats. One held oak staves submerged beneath stones. The other was empty except for iron hoops and scraps of old wood. Tamsin marked all 17 with white chalk. Then she rolled the first into the lane. The neighbors watched as she tipped it onto a cart. The dyer came from his yard. A shoemaker paused with an awl still in his hand. "Those are sold," the dyer said. "Some are." Mira put one hand on its new oak head. "I have not paid you." They returned with pickle casks, flour barrels, and one small keg in which the elderly cat had been sleeping. The cat objected, then accepted a folded grain sack as an alternative. Others followed slowly. The fishmonger surrendered a salt barrel after scraping it clean. The cloth guild sent indigo vats that Tamsin rejected because the dye had entered too deeply. A widow from Weaver's Rise offered the small cask in which she had kept apples since her husband made it 30 years before. Tamsin inspected the hoops and told her to keep it. "But it holds," the widow said. "It also belongs beside your hearth. This cask has earned its rest." A pepper merchant produced a small chestnut keg whose scent made everyone nearby sneeze until Tamsin sent it away. Each sound vessel received a number, its owner's name, its capacity, and a mark showing which branch it would serve. Oren organized the record. At first, he wrote alone. Then, when the queue reached across the market, he asked 2 school pupils to help. He showed them how to leave space for changes and how to draw an owner's mark when the owner could not write a name. He did not call the ledger a sketchbook, but it filled with small pictures: shears for a tailor, a loaf for Mira's bakehouse, a fox for a family named Voss, crossed needles for 2 sisters who always worked together. Jory returned from the lower coppice with 6 casks and 7 people. Sella came in a cart atop folded sacks, holding her hazel stick like a staff of office. The charcoal families brought coils of rope, hazel poles, spades, resin, and the useful knowledge of how to move heavy things on steep ground. At the gate, a clerk asked whether their vessels were town property or outer holding property. "They are barrels," Oren said before Jory could answer. "Put them in the same book." Smiths made clamps and tap fittings. Potters produced fired clay floats that would rise inside the casks, lifting painted rods through small holes in the lids to show water level. Tamsin moved between them with the unfinished red plan folded into her coat. At the monastery, she showed novices how to wrap a threaded joint with combed flax before tightening the wooden collar. At the Eastern washhouse, she rejected a platform that leaned half a finger's width and made the builders level it before placing a full ton. In the market, she taught householders to listen for the clean note of a tight hoop. Along the southern line, she and Jory fitted 2 storage casks near the old valve chamber, protecting them beneath a roof of split oak. "You trust us with the gate?" Jory asked. "Can you read the level rod?" "I will be sure to tell them." "Little whistles?" "Ah, trapped in a rising pipe, could halt water as surely as a closed valve. Yet the outer line mostly descended." "Why would old builders have installed several vents there?" "Who made them?" Her finger passed over the fish, the ladder, the cross, and stopped at the two curved cuts of the reed leaf. "That one was on a box," she said, "or one like it. Jory, Caddock, and a crew from Bellhaven built a low diversion of stone and woven willow along the firm ridge. It did not force the whole stream into the old course. It invited half of it toward the spring house and left half to descend naturally, westward. The recovered flow entered the northern reservoir, clear enough to see every pebble beneath it. Tamsin ordered the reservoir gate opened only 1/4. The first test would fill 12 neighborhood stores, not the entire network. Workers gathered at the northern tank, along the market branch, in the bakehouse, and beyond the southern wall. Messengers waited between them. A red flag meant a leak. A white flag meant water had arrived. The bells remained silent, so their sound would not confuse the signals. Tamsin stood in the market inspection chamber with Halric. Oren waited above, ready to record the time. The conduit beneath them was cool and still. "Open," Tamsin called. The message passed uphill. For a while, nothing happened. Then the pipe gave a low murmur. Water touched wood. The sound deepened into a steady rush. At the northern gate, a white flag lifted. Another appeared on Weaver's Rise. The market fountain coughed air and began to run. A quiet cheer moved through the square. Tamsin did not join it. She watched the pipe collars. The first storage cask began filling. Its clay float rose. At the bakehouse, linnet waved white from the roof. The western cistern was taking water. Then the market conduit struck once from within. Tamsin placed her hand on it. The second blow shook dust from the chamber wall. "Close the northern gate by half," she said. Halric signaled, but the message had to travel. Water struck again, harder. Somewhere below, wood groaned. A red flag appeared on Tallow Street. Another rose at the southern wall. The market cask's level rod stopped climbing. It jerked downward. Air burst from the fountain with a hollow roar, throwing water across the basin. People stepped back. "Close all branches," Tamsin called. Gate taps turned. The reservoir outlet began to shut, but the water already in the network had gathered behind pockets of air. Pressure rose unevenly, finding every weak joint. At the bakehouse, a collar opened. Water poured beneath the western oven platform and spread across the floor. In the old dye quarter, one of the new elm staves split along grain. Tamsin had inspected herself. Beyond the southern wall, the widened valve chamber lifted against its pegs and flooded the path. No one was hurt. The water had entered gradually enough for people to move clear. Yet when the last branch closed, Bellhaven stood among soaked floors, half-filled casks, and a silence heavier than the one before the test. Tamsin climbed from the inspection chamber. The market fountain dripped. Water darkened the front of her coat. Across the square, people lowered their red flags. It had happened more slowly 8 years ago. During the spring thaw, her father had replaced the upper conduit where it descended from the reservoir. The old pipe there rose over a shoulder of rock before dropping steeply toward the gate. Air had always gathered at the crest. Her father's repair held through 2 careful tests. On the third, the council had ordered the reservoir opened fully because planting season had begun and the lower cisterns were empty. Tamsin had been 22. She had stood in the upper chamber with both hands on the new oak while pressure gathered beneath them. The wood trembled. Her father shouted for the gate to close. Before the message reached the reservoir, a collar tore free. Water broke through the chamber wall and followed the street downhill. It entered the grain sheds, lifted sacks, and turned the lane into brown foam. Tamsin remembered wheat moving in the water like thousands of pale insects. She remembered her father sitting afterward on the curb, holding one iron collar and saying nothing. The inquiry decided the joint had been underbound. Her father had insisted there was trapped air, but the old vent box at the crest had been removed during the repair because its base was rotten. The replacement box appeared in the plan as a minor finishing task. It had not been installed before the council ordered the full test. Her father accepted the judgment. He said he should have refused to open the line. Tamsin accepted another judgment, one no council had spoken. Public work placed good craft into the hands of people who could hurry it, misread it, and remember it only when it failed. So she had made barrels. Barrels remained where she could see them. Now the entire town resembled that old chamber. Her network held more vents than the former line, yet not enough. She had known air might gather. She had heard it beneath the wall. She had been so intent on distributing water that she had treated the moving air as a detail to manage later. Mira crossed the square, her apron soaked to the knees. The oven fire is safe. We can reset it. The charcoal families had trusted the town and received a flooded path. Every part of the work seemed to carry her mark, whether she had cut it or not. We built too quickly, she said. We built at the speed the weather allowed. Perhaps the branch gates closed in the wrong order. Perhaps the storage feeds are too narrow. The sound meant the high sheep had reached town. It also meant the count was nearly done. Tamsin went home. She did not intend to abandon the work. She went because memory had placed a hand upon her shoulder, turning her toward the old inspection, hollow beneath her floor. In the workshop, she lit her father's oil lamp. The dark half-circle upon the plank matched its base. She lifted the boards and lowered herself into the hollow. The branch pipe still seeped at one collar. She followed it on hands and knees until the space narrowed near the foundation wall. Her father had replaced this section during the same spring as the upper failure. Tamsin remembered shaping two of the staves. She had not entered the hollow since. The reed mark appeared beneath the tar. Beside it was a small round plug, no wider than a quill. Tamsin cleaned it with the edge of her knife. The plug was made of willow, softer than the oak around it. Another lay 3 paces farther on, placed at a slight rise. Neither appeared on Oren's plan. Neither connected to a vent box. They seemed too small to matter. She loosened the first plug. Air whispered around it. For several breaths, the sound continued. Then a thread of water appeared. Tamsin pressed the plug back and sat in the cramped darkness with the lamp beside her knee. Her father had vented the line without a box. Small openings, placed where air could gather, sealed with wood, soft enough to ease loose but tight enough to swell against water. They were not meant to release great pressure. They were meant to prevent it from gathering unseen. She crawled onward. At every rise, she found another willow plug. The method would not have saved the upper conduit after the council removed its vent box and opened the full reservoir. These openings were too small for that. Her father's failure remained a failure. He had permitted a test he believed unsafe. But afterward, he had understood more than the inquiry recorded. In the branch below their own workshop, he had quietly built his understanding into the wood. Tamsin remembered his silence differently. Not emptiness, not surrender. Work, waiting for someone to look closely enough. She took out her knife and cut the reed mark beside the nearest plug, not to claim it, but to continue it. Then she climbed from the hollow and carried the lamp back into the street. Oren was waiting outside. He held his soft grey notebook beneath his cloak. Snow grains had gathered in his beard. "I thought you might come here," he said. "Why?" "After the hearing, your father asked me to add a statement to the record. He described the missing vent and the order to open the reservoir. I told him the judgment had been entered and could be amended only by a full vote. He never returned to request one. Tamsin felt anger, but it came without the sharpness she had carried for years. Oren stood before her as an old man who had kept every official line straight and had only now begun to see what those lines excluded. "Why tell me?" she asked. "Because I have mistaken procedure for truth more than once." He held out the notebook. "And because what is written can still be changed. We need many little ones. We install boxes where we can. Where we cannot, we use soft plugs and guarded taps. Then we fill each branch alone, from the lowest store upward. No one closes a gate until the air above it has left. Begin there. If they filled the high branches first, air would be driven into the lower bends and trapped there." So the workers went beyond the southern wall with hooded lanterns, tools wrapped in sacking, and willow pegs tucked into their pockets. The flooded path had become a chain of shallow pools. Jory's people laid market planks across the mud. The wood that had been a spice counter one week and a conduit stave the next now served as a bridge for the hands repairing that conduit. Tamsin noticed this and thought her father would have appreciated the economy of it. At the valve chamber, Halrich's crew lifted the swollen cover. The main gate still held, but its housing had risen from one side. They reset it upon new pegs and packed the base with clay, flax, and resin. Above the chamber, they fitted a vent box made from the sound end of a narrow cask. A reed-thin pipe rose through its lid, controlled by a small tap. Sella sat beneath the oak with blankets around her shoulders, warming her hands over a covered brazier. "Taller than a boot," she said when the box was placed, "like the old ones." The last was a willow plug, where the pipe rose beneath the wall and no room existed for anything larger. Tamsin cut each plug herself at first. Then she placed the knife in Linnet's hand. "Willow is soft," she said, "but the grain must still run straight. If it crosses, the plug may shear when removed." By the third, she no longer looked toward Tamsin before trimming the end. "Good," Tamsin said. The word surprised them both. Inside the wall, Mira organized the branches as she organized ovens. No branch opened until the one below it sent word. No storage vessel filled until its vent released clean water. Messengers wore colored cords, so instructions would not become confused. Red for closing, white for opening, blue for reporting levels. Children too young to work. The pipes sat in warm doorways and wound the cords into coils. Oren moved through the town with his notebook, recording every new vent and gate. For the first time in Bellhaven's records, the line on the map followed the conduit in the ground. He marked the outer loop in blue-green ink and wrote beside the charcoal branch, maintained by the households of the lower coppice, under the water agreement made after the southern landslip. There was still no parchment bearing the original bargain. He did not allow the absence to erase it. At the northern reservoir, the gate remained closed while the last repairs were made. The recovered spring water filled the stone tank and spilled through its overflow. Brother Caddock watched the diversion on the mountain. If the woven barrier shifted, he would ring the shelter bell 3 times, wait, and ring 3 again. A shepherd at the pine edge would repeat the signal. The northern gate would carry it into town. No such warning came. Near midnight, Tamsin gathered the branch keepers in the market. Snow floated in the lantern light, but melted when it reached the paving stones. The people of Bellhaven had not called it the first snow. The bells were silent. According to custom, snow had to cover the point of a roof tile and remain there long enough for a person to count to 100. These flakes were only scouts, Mira said, sent to see whether the town was ready. Tamsin was not ready. Readiness no longer seemed a state she could achieve before acting. She unfolded the map upon the covered fish stall. Water spots had wrinkled its corners. New lines crowded the old ones. Around it stood Halrich, Jory, Mira, Oren, Linnet, 2 monastery novices, 3 street wardens, the eastern washerwoman, and the keeper of the northern reservoir. "We open 1/8, Tamsin said. "No more. The outer loop vents first, then Tallow Street, then the market. After the market reports, clear water, we open the bakehouse and eastern branches. Every storage feed remains shut until its main line is full. Do not let a white flag mean what you hope," she told them. "Let it mean what you hear." "I have heard pipes spit before you had teeth," she said. The hiss deepened. A mist touched the lantern glass. Then water rose in a clean thread. Jory closed the tap and lifted the white flag. Along the wall, another vent opened. On Tallow Street, Halric waited with his hand upon a guarded plug. The pipe clicked. Air came out in pulses, each weaker than the last. When water followed, he sent the signal uphill. At the market, Tamsin waited. The fountain gave a sigh. The pipe beneath her fingers remained quiet. Then a low current entered it, so smooth that for one uneasy moment she wondered if she imagined it. The clay float in the public cistern stirred. She opened the market vent. Air whispered from it, not striking, not gathering, simply leaving because a path had been made. Water beaded around the tap. "Open the bakehouse branch," she said. The words passed through the messenger line. Mira stood beside the western cistern. Linnet had returned there to tend the upper vent. The collar that failed earlier had been reset with a wider band and a new flax seal. As water entered, the joint darkened but did not leak. "Air!" Linnet called. The vent sang a thin, wavering note. Mira watched the level rod. It did not move. "Still air," Linnet said. Time lengthened. The ovens had cooled. The bakehouse lamps burned low. Around them, bowls and paddles waited on clean tables. Mira resisted the urge to open the feed farther. She had spent her life knowing when dough needed haste and when it needed to be left untouched. She gave the pipe the same patience. At last, the note softened. Water appeared. The level rod began to rise. At the eastern washhouse, a new vent clogged with fibers from its flax packing. The branch knocked once. The washerwoman closed her gate before the pressure built, cleared the tap with a wire, and opened it again. No red flag was needed. At Weaver's Rise, a cask seam began to weep. The keeper isolated that vessel and shifted its share to 2 smaller barrels. At the monastery, one novice mistook mixed flow for clear water, but the second listened again and kept the vent open. The system did not move as one machine. It moved as many people making small corrections. Tamsin walked the branches. At each rise she listened, placed a hand upon wood, and asked what the keepers had heard. She did not take every tool from them. She let Linnet reseat a plug. She let the washerwoman decide when her line was clear. At the southern wall, she asked Jory whether the outer gate should open another quarter. He checked the basin flow, the lower cask levels, and the mark Tamsin had drawn upon the valve stem. "Not yet," he said. "The townward line is filling faster than ours." The clay rods rose above their lids, showing bands of black, blue, and red. Black meant 1 quarter, blue meant half, red meant enough for morning use. When a red band appeared, a keeper closed that feed and allowed more water to pass to the next branch. Bellhaven took on a different sound, not the unchecked murmur of fountains, but quiet signals moving through the streets. A tap closed. A flag cloth snapped once in the wind. Boots crossed wet stones. Someone called a level. Someone else repeated it. Underneath came the subdued movement of water, entering 100 wooden chambers. Oren stood at the market table, placing small stones upon the plan for every store that reached red. At first, they were scattered. Then they formed clusters. "Bakehouse full," said a messenger. Oren set down a white pebble. "Eastern washhouse at half." The monastery cistern was nearly full, but 3 smaller stores above the market remained empty. Tamsin hurried to the reservoir and found the main tank high. The outlet line held water. Somewhere between the tank and the northern gate, Flo had caught. She listened at the first inspection chamber. Knocking sounded faintly uphill. "A high pocket," Halric said. "We marked every rise. There was a stair here before the northern tower was enlarged. At their new low flow, it had become a barrier." Tamsin considered cutting into the upper stave. If water had gathered beneath pressure, a careless opening might split the wood. She placed the listening rod at the crest. The knocking continued, almost delicate now. "Willow plug?" Halric asked. "Guarded tap. This one remains after winter." It passed over them with the cool scent of the spring. Then water rose clear into the tap and caught the lantern glow. From beyond the gatehouse came a deep, even rush. Halric laughed once. It was a small, tired sound, quickly swallowed by the chamber. Tamsin closed the tap and pressed her palm to the wood. No blow followed, no tremor, only movement. "Send the signal," she said. The remaining stores began to fill. Dawn arrived without sun. The clouds lowered until the hills disappeared. Snow fell in flakes large enough to rest upon the roofs, but still the bells waited. People emerged from houses with bowls, pails, and jugs. At each branch, the keepers announced how much had gathered and how much could be drawn. The fountains remained closed. For the first time, Bellhaven understood that the water beneath its streets was not endless, because it had always sounded endless. No household received all it wanted. Every household received enough. At the bakehouse, Mira opened both ovens. Water from the western cistern filled the mixing trough. The first loaves were plain. Rye because rye needed less careful handling than the wheat dough delayed by the crisis. As their crusts browned, the warm smell moved into the market. At the lower coppice, Jory filled Sella's kettle from the restored basin. The outer casks stood at red. He adjusted the gate toward town by one small measure, exactly as the painted marks required. At the monastery, water reached the infirmary tank. At the washhouse, the women used half their stored share and saved half for evening. The mill turned only one wheel. The dyers agreed not to fill their vats until the next night. Bellhaven's life continued in smaller portions, and because each portion was seen, it was valued. Tamsin returned to the market as the first bread came from the ovens. She had been awake for more than a day. Mud covered her boots. Resin marked her sleeves. A shallow cut crossed one thumb where the drill had slipped. Mira placed a hot rye loaf into her hands and told her to sit on the fountain edge. "The pipes are not finished," Tamsin said. "Neither is the bread. There are 12 more batches. We still take it out of the oven when it is ready." Around the square, people ate bread standing up, leaning against carts, or sitting on stacks of timber that would become spring market stalls. Oren slept with his head upon the record table and one hand resting near the map. Halric had gone to check the northern vent again. Linnet was showing 2 younger apprentices how soot revealed a poor stave joint. The first flake settled upon the tip of the council hall roof. Another rested beside it. Within moments, the slate edges turned white. The market paving held the snow in thin lines between stones. Children began counting aloud, each at a different speed, until Mira made them start together. At 100, the snow remained. The northern gate bell rang first. Its iron voice crossed the rooftops, slow and strong. The monastery answered with a higher bronze note. Then the school bell sounded, though there were no lessons that day. The market bell joined, followed by the watchtower, the bakehouse handbell, the wool hall bell, and the little bell above the eastern washhouse. One after another, the 12 voices of Bellhaven entered the snow. The last came from the southern gate. Jory and 2 children from the lower coppice had reached it just before the road began to whiten. The gate warden let the children pull the rope. Their bell swung above the arch, carrying its sound both into the town and down among the oak trees. Tamsin counted all 12. Beneath them, she heard the market storage cask filling. The sound was not loud. Water entered through a narrow feed and touched the inner staves with a patient, continuous murmur. Before the first snow reached Bellhaven, the system had not been restored as it was. It had become something else. The town spent the first snow day indoors where it could, but the work did not end. Keepers took turns at the branches. The reservoir gate remained low. Every 6 hours, Oren gathered the levels and moved his pebbles upon the map. When one street used more, another lent from its store. 2 casks opened at their seams and were replaced. A vent at the monastery froze near sunset, so the novices wrapped its box in wool and built a small roof above it. Brother Cadoc's signal came at midday. 3 rings, repeated 3 times. For a few anxious minutes, the town believed the diversion had failed. Then the northern gate relayed the full message. The western half of the changed stream had begun to freeze at its edges, but the woven barrier remained sound. The spring house flow was steady. By the following morning, the new network had filled every major cistern. The council did not call it permanent. Tamsin did not call it temporary. Those were words for a later season. For winter, it was enough that it worked. 3 days after the snow, Bellhaven held a meal in the cloth hall. It was not a feast, for winter stores had to be guarded. Mira baked onion pies, oat loaves, and small honey cakes from the monastery's last autumn comb. The charcoal families brought smoked mushrooms and chestnuts. The wool merchants provided benches from their warehouse. People ate beside the pipe forms and steam cauldrons, which no one had yet found time to remove. At the central table lay Oren's new ledger. It was larger than his gray notebook and less handsome than the official civic book. Its pages contained measurements, owners' names, branch levels, repair dates, and drawings of every craft mark found beneath the tar. Beside the ladder sign, the fish, the cross, and the divided circle, Oren had written where each appeared. Unknown names were not left blank. They were entered as unknown workers, with the marks preserved. Jory's name stood beside the southern gate valve. Sella's memory of the old vents stood in the margin. Linnet's name appeared beside the suit test. The washerwoman, the smith, the carpenters, the sawyers, the school pupils, the market traders, the novices, and every household that lent a sound cask had a place. Oren brought the official ledger as well. Before the meal ended, he opened it to the entry written 8 years earlier. He did not scratch out the judgment or pretend the flood had not occurred. Beneath it, in clear ink, he added the statement. Tamsin's father had once asked him to record that the upper vent had been removed, that he had objected to the full pressure test, and that he accepted responsibility for opening a line. He believed unsafe. Then Oren added a second entry. It described the willow vents found beneath Tamsin's workshop and credited Rowan Reed with the method that helped guide the winter repair. He should have been heard while he lived, Oren said to Tamsin. This does not correct that. By old custom, the craftsperson in charge would place a sign there, making the work theirs before the town. Tamsin drew the reed leaf. Then she passed the pen to Halric. He added a small iron collar. Mira drew a loaf. Jory made 3 upright charcoal sticks. Linnet placed a lamp-black dot beside the mark she had chosen, a circle with an open top, like a cask waiting to fill. The pen went around the hall. By the time it returned, the space beneath the entry had become a field of signs. No mark was large enough to dominate the others. Tamsin waited for the ink to dry, then closed the book. Outside, snow softened the market roofs and covered the place where the stalls had stood. The fountain remained closed for winter, but a small tap beside it filled cups during the day. Each evening, the branch keeper shut it and recorded the level. The first spring market would need new stalls. Fresh-cut boards already waited beneath a shed to season as well as they could. The permanent second reservoir would need masons, a safer channel, and a council vote. The main conduit still held sections old enough to have known the grandparents of everyone living. There would always be more work than one winter could finish. Tamsin returned to her workshop after the meal. 17 pale circles showed where her casks had stood. The loft felt larger and less secure without them. She could hear the branch pipe beneath the floor, no longer sleeping. She lifted the inspection plank and checked the nearest willow plug. It held. Before replacing the board, she set her father's lamp beside it for a moment. Its light fell upon the 2 reed marks, one old and one new. Then she carried the lamp upstairs. In the weeks that followed, her workshop was not quiet. Apprentices came to learn conduit curves. Branch keepers brought level reports. Jory visited from the lower coppice whenever the valve needed adjustment, and sometimes when it did not. Mira reclaimed the flour cask, but refused to pay until Tamsin accepted 6 jars of winter, preserves in the bargain. 5 vegetables and 1 root? Tamsin asked. 4 vegetables, 1 root, and pears. Water moved beneath them, through old staves and new, past marks cut by hands, remembered and unremembered. It filled town cisterns and the basin beneath the oak. It entered barrels that had once held ale, apples, flour, and pickles. In spring, some would be returned. Some would remain where they stood, because their owners decided they belonged to the branches now. And when Bellhaven finally built the second reservoir above the northern wall, no single master's name was carved upon it. Along the coping stones ran a narrow band of small signs copied from Oren's book. The ladder, the fish, the cross, the loaf, the charcoal sticks, the open circle, and the reed leaf among them. But that came later, after thaw and lambing, after the spring road opened and the market stalls rose again. The part remembered most clearly was the night before the snow, when the town learned to listen, not only for bells, but for air leaving, the dark and water-finding room. In the tavern, the storyteller fell silent. The kettle over the coals had long since begun to steam. The tavern keeper poured hot water into cups where slices of dried apple and sprigs of thyme waited. Rain still touched the windows, though its sound had softened. The southern traveler looked at the small brass bell beside the chimney. "Did Bellhaven keep all 12 bells?" he asked. "As far as I know," said the storyteller, though bells, like pipes and stories, are rarely kept by one person alone. It held hedges, milestones, sleeping farms, and every small stream making its way downhill. Then the outer door opened. A woman who had been tending the stable stepped inside with snow upon her shoulders. Not rain turned briefly white, but broad quiet flakes that rested in her hair and along the folds of her coat. Cold air crossed the room. The little brass bell moved. For the first time anyone could remember, it rang once. The note was so light that it might have been lost beneath conversation, had conversation not already ceased. It shone for a moment above the fire, clear and complete, then faded into the old beams. No one asked whether the bell had belonged to a goat or a barge. No one counted the snow upon the sill. The tavern keeper closed the door, stirred the coals, and filled 1 more cup. Outside, the first flakes settled upon the road. Inside, the kettle had enough water for everyone.